it seems moving over to the manuscript evidence has really hit a nerve for many of you. I'm excited to see how many of you have come on board and also are watching these last few videos. I think I'm breaking all records as far as the number of viewership. Maybe that stands to reason, I think, because so many of you are beginning to get it. In fact, what I wanted to do, rather than get into the questions right now, I'll be getting into those and trying to answer them. I would like to look at some of your comments, because I've been looking at the comments, I've been reading them, and quite a few of you are getting it. You're making amazing progress. I'm just excited to see not only how you're getting it here. Some of you are going beyond what I would even say. But I just picked out a number of here. Let me just start with this one here by Ngata Tan or Ngata Tan. He says this: Dear Brother Jay, the other thing about the biblical manuscripts, according to Dr. James White, those of you who don't know, Dr. James White, Alpha and Omega Ministries, he has done an amazing job of unpacking, very good at bringing an enormous amount of research on the biblical manuscripts. He says this: the biblical manuscripts are copied freely and without censorship. And with the mass of manuscripts from completely different strands of copies, they still have the consistency of account despite the transition errors or even scribal insertions. So Dr. James White admits that there are scribal errors, and we know that there's different variants. We've always been, in fact, this is always something that's curious to me, Muslims, when they get so upset and they go berserk when we admit this. When have we not admitted this? Maybe there are some Christians that refuse to admit it, but I know that James White and myself and David Wood and Sam Shimon Al-Fadi, Hatun, we all admit that there are manuscript variants. That's the beauty of the Bible. We not only admit it, we're transparent about it, and we even warn the readers, like in the end of Mark 16, we warn the readers that these verses that are from verse 9 to 20 are possibly, they could be from the original, but we don't know, because all we have are the Greek manuscripts, which are the earliest to go back to. So this idea that that there was some type of censorship like we have with the Quran. Notice the Quran was censored almost immediately. We see that. I mean, every Muslim knows this, because look what Uthman did. He censored the Quran absolutely right there in 652. In 652, he took any other Quran that disagreed with the Qurayshi manuscript, and he burned them. That's called censorship. Do you see anything like this in Christianity? Is there any burning of any manuscripts or of any biblical text, any script anywhere? Not by Christians. By non-Christians, yes. The Edict of Diocletian in 303 AD. That was the burning of manuscripts, but it wasn't by us; it was by the Romans, and so that's why make sure that you get that historical context and get it correctly. But then he goes on, and this is what he says: despite this, despite the copies of copies, we know where the transition errors are, and even the scribal insertions. But despite all this, it's not just the manuscripts, he says, combined with writings of the early church fathers referring to the original scripts. I believe that Dr. Daniel Wallace out of Texas is confident that the original text can be reconstructed from all these sources. JAMIN DAVID Seah agrees with this. Look what he says here. Muslims also forget that the collection of the writings from the early church fathers, again, these predate the 3rd and 4th century completed manuscripts, such as the Vaticanus or the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus that I have put up many times already, contain quotations that can be used to reconstruct the entire New Testament all on its own. Talk about a wealth of evidence, something the Quran cannot even begin to hold a candle to when compared. Muslims did light candles to burn their own conflicting scriptures, referring back to the Uthmanic recension, how that when it was created, they burnt everything else that disagreed with it in 652. So what are we talking about? I mean, what is Ngata Tan and JAMIN David Seah referring to? Well, they're referring to all the other material that is outside the manuscript evidence. See, not only do we have the manuscript evidence, let's just look at that. We have, about 5,300, some say 5,800 Greek manuscripts. Those are the earliest. On top of that, we have 10,000 Latin Vulgates. We have another 9,000 in 11 different languages. 11 different languages, not just only in the two that we've talked about. If you add all those up, that's roughly about 24,000 manuscripts that we can go to. Now, I'm not saying they're all early. No, I'm not saying that they're all early. We have about 365 of them that predate the 6th century. Those would be earlier. That means they are all before the Quran. They're all before the earliest Quranic manuscripts. That's important. That's important. Now, these 365 are not all complete. Some of them are just fragments, like we've been talking about in the other videos. But you have the 3 complete ones, like the Vaticanus, the Sinaiticus, and the Alexandrinus, 2 of them from the 4th century, and 1 from the 5th century. But that's not all we have. See, we're not only dependent on the manuscript evidence. No. I love the fact that we have another 2,135 lectionaries from the 6th century. That's 100 years before Islam. From the 6th century, that's the century before Islam, we can go back. Those are extant. We can look at them. 2,135 of them. Look and see what they say. Lectionaries were really what people would do in church services. This is the liturgy that they would recite. And these lectionaries are biblical scriptures. These are scriptures that they would recite in church services. That's why they were put into codices, and they still exist today. So that's 100 years before the Quranic material even gets into existence. And take a look at the lectionaries, compare them with the manuscript, and you'll see they're all the same. But that's still not the only thing we have. So we have the manuscripts, we have the lectionaries, completely 2 different genres. And then there's the early church fathers' quotations. And that's why both Yamin and both Ngata are referring to that. Most of you probably don't know what we're talking about. In the very beginning, there in the 1st century, when the gospel accounts were being written in the 1st century and they were being distributed by letters to the different churches, it was all done undercover, this is done underground, because they were being persecuted. Understandably, listen, historically, that is very true. They were being persecuted. Since they were being persecuted, they would have people who were coming into the church who were disputing. Now, the early church fathers had to do something about that. They could have had debates with these individuals, but they, rather than do that, they would write letters to confront or to answer the questions that these early converts, many of them coming from Gnosticism. And what they would do is they would, rather than sit there and dispute it like I would do, I love to debate, that's what I do. It's second nature to me, I guess, because of the 25 years I spent at Speaker's Corner. They didn't do that. What they did is they would respond to every one of these questions, respond to every one of these confrontations with biblical scripture, basically saying, this is what God says, this is what Jesus said, this is what we see him saying and doing, and what he said is what we stand by. And so they would just quote from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, from the letters of Paul, and from the other writings of the New Testament. And that's why it was in a completely different genre, a completely different context from the manuscript evidence. So people like Dr. David Dalrymple, Dr. Jean Burgon, people like that in the last century started amalgamating all of these early church fathers' quotations, and they have come up with 86,000 of these early church fathers' quotations. That's the figure that I know of. It may be even larger. Some of you may dispute with the number, but 86,000. Now, however, many of them are not early, so that's why it's important that we look at the earliest ones, the ones that predate the 4th century, the ones that go before the Sinaiticus or the Alexandrinus or the Vaticanus, the 3 metropolitan codices, those that predate the 4th century. If you look at just those, you can come up with 36,000 of these quotations. I'm going to just put a graph. Just look at these. And you can see these 36,000 quotations. Hold on a minute. I'm just going to look at some of them here. So what are we talking about here? 36,289, I think, is the exact count of these quotations. I'm just going to bring up my computer here and just quote some of them. Look, here we go. Clement of Alexandria, 2,406 quotations from before the 4th century. Tertullian, 7,258 quotations. Justin Martyr, over 330 quotations. Irenaeus, 1,819 quotations. Origen, 17,920. That's almost 18,000 quotations just from Origen alone. Hippolytus, 1,300 quotations. Eusebius, 5,000. You add that up, it comes to 36,289. Now, do they include all of the New Testament? No, they don't. And I'm not suggesting that, therefore, that these quotations cover the entire New Testament from before the 4th century. By the time you get to the 86,000, almost all the New Testament is covered. But what about the Gospel of John? This is the one that I find the most exciting. See, the Gospel of John is the one that Muslims dispute the most because it has by far the highest Christology. It has the divinity of Jesus all the way through, and that's why Muslims attack it the most. Let's just look at the Gospel of John from these quotations that I've just talked about from before the 4th century. That's in the first 300 years. If you just look at the quotations of the Gospel of John, from Clement of Alexander, Tertullian, Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, Hippolytus, and Eusebius, just those 6, you can reproduce the entire Gospel of John except for 11 verses. Except for 11 verses. That's how much material we have. Now stop and think that through, the significance of what I've just said. See, the early church fathers' quotations are not manuscript evidence. They are a complete different genre than the manuscript evidence. So we're not just giving you one genre, we're giving you 3 different genres of evidence we have for the New Testament alone from the first 4 centuries, within 300 years. That's why we're making this claim. If we can come up with that much material from the first 3 centuries, 300 years after Christ's death, why can't Muslims come up with even one Quran from the 7th century? And for 300 years after Islam, or after Muhammad died, if he died in 632, can Muslims come up with one Quran within those 300 years that is complete, that has 114 surahs, that is exactly like this Quran that I have in my hand here. By the way, I've just got a new one here. This is the new one now. I've just received. And so this is the new Hafs. This will be the new Hafs that I'll be using. But can any Muslim come up with one manuscript of the Quran that equals this from the first 300 years? No, you can't. Or you can come up with fragments here. You can come up with manuscript of manuscript. Not any of the earliest manuscripts are complete. And we've been asking this, I've been asking this for 25 years. Please, Muslims, give us a manuscript that is at least within the... I'd love it in the 1st century. I know you can't find it. How about the 2nd century? How about the 3rd century? That is complete. 114 surahs exactly like this Quran. That has been compared, razm with razm, letter with letter, word for word, like you keep claiming. Don't use the qira'ats. This is a totally different argument. We're talking about manuscript evidence. We're not talking about diacritical marks, and we're not talking about vowelization. We're talking about the consonantal text. Can you see we moved on to a whole different genre? This is why this is going to be difficult for an awful lot of you Muslims to listen to. We've done our homework. Christians have done their homework. We have been disputed. We've had all kinds of controversy. We have been confronted from the 1800s. This has been confronted. The fact that we have done our homework and come up with this kind of material, all these background, this kind of resources, helps us to not only be able to argue this much more clearly, but then to demand the same thing of you Muslims. You need, before you say your Quran has never been corrupted, never been changed, that you can go right back to the beginning, right back to the 7th century, and show us a complete manuscript, which you can't, but that you can even say that your Qurans are better than our Bibles as far as manuscript evidence. We're going to start holding you to that. This is not the first time I've asked you this. So can you come up with anything like what we have? Do you have quotations that you can quote from the 7th century? Do you have things like our liturgy that you can quote, lectionaries that you can quote from the 1st century? No. All of your material comes from the 9th and 10th century. 200 to 300 years after the 7th century. 200 to 300 years after Muhammad. 200 to 300 years after the material that they're referring to. Proving that before you complain about our manuscript evidence, please put your house in order. We've given you 3 different reference points, 3 different genres. Both the manuscripts and the lectionaries and the early church fathers' quotations. What do you have in return? That's all we're asking. We're waiting for you. God bless you. This is Jay. Over and out.